Thanks so much, John. That's great. Good morning, everybody, again. And we're going to have a look through that passage today. We're still going through Matthew and the stories of Jesus. And if you haven't been sort of tracking with us, we've actually been doing it over a few years and just going through different sections and calling them calling the section a specific thing. And this section we're calling the Clash of Kingdoms, because as the story goes through, and if you were to just read through Matthew's Gospel, you'd notice that right at the start, there's all this clash around Jesus' birth even, but then it just kind of builds and builds and builds. Ultimately, what we're heading towards at Easter and Good Friday of his death and resurrection. And we're seeing more and more tension between Jesus and the religious leaders, and it's in the context of the already tension there between Israel and Rome, and there's just all this tension, and Jesus finds himself right in the middle of it in this story today. So I'm just going to pray, and then we'll start to have a look at it today. So we thank you, Lord, for your word. Thank you for your spirit. We just invite you, Jesus, to speak to our hearts. And we just want to meet with you and hear from you and invite you to speak to us personally and renew our minds and challenge our assumptions and reveal your kingdom in our midst. And so we just pray your presence and spirit to move in this time in your name. Amen. So obviously this story, as we heard, is about a trap that involves bait. I know there's some people who are into fishing. I'm not really great at fishing, but this is what fishermen are great at, right? Deceiving fish. Like you use a nice little piece of bait or get a lure. Kurt was telling me about his nice lures. And you're trying to trick a fish to make the fish think they're going to have this awesome snack, but then they eat it and you hook them. That's what people do when they fish, right? But I don't know if you're aware of it, but that doesn't happen just at fishing. That might have even happened to you already today, because there's things that are trying to catch us. You might innocently open your computer, just want to check some news, and all of a sudden there's this link to something that looks like amazing, like click this thing and everything will be fixed and all the problems will be made right, and then you click it and it's like, oh, it's not that good, and it's clickbait, right? Like that's just everywhere. Like people are trying to trap and pull you in and kind of grab your attention, and obviously that's not that significant, but there's this sort of thing of sometimes when people are kind of trying to bring about a trap, there's a deception in it, and that's what we see happening with Jesus. They're trying to actually trap him, but they're doing it by really buttering him up to start with. But what we want to look at is just this, the context of this passage. So in Matthew 22, it says, the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. So the last couple of weeks we've been looking through Matthew, and Jesus has been telling parables or stories that he's really been confronting the religious leaders because they're not believing him, and he's showing them the seriousness of this. The next, where we are now, it kind of flips, and now they're kind of counterattacking him. They're coming back at him with questions, and you can see that their intent is to trap. They have bait, and they've made a plan. They've actually gone away, they've got concocted this plan of this is how we're going to catch Jesus and get him to say something that's going to put him in trouble. But what's really interesting is who is laying the trap. It's the Pharisees who are behind it, but they're sending their disciples. So it's their students and also the Herodians. Now, the Herodians are followers of or supporters of King Herod. So the context is Israel is a nation that believes they're God's people, but they are under the rule of another occupying nation, a pagan empire called Rome, which they resent and hate. So there's all this tension in Israel because they're supposed to be God's people, but they find themselves under Roman occupation, which creates all this pressure and all this difficulty. And then there's all these differences of, well, how do we respond to the Roman occupation? The Pharisees respond by resenting Rome. They think they just want Rome to be gone, and they try to protect themselves and try to be pure and try to follow God, the God of Israel, as well as they can, and just resent anything to do with Rome. But in this case, they actually have to pay a tax, which then is like a conflict. What do they do? But the Herodians are really the opposite. Herod is a Jewish king, but he's like a puppet king under Rome, he's compromised with the Romans. He is benefiting from the Roman occupation. He has just taken the road of comfort and prestige, and these are people who are supporting him. So they're very different relationships to Rome, but they are united to confront Jesus. with this plan and this trap. So they come to him and they say, "Teacher, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" So they are like totally trying to flatter and butter up Jesus and pull him into saying something that's going to get him into trouble. But the really interesting thing is, what they're saying is like totally true. It's actually an amazing description of Jesus. Like they just describe Jesus so well. They say Jesus is a man of integrity, which is true. He teaches the way of God and he's not swayed by others. He doesn't care what people think. He's just committed to God and the truth. That is totally true of Jesus, and this story will prove that. And the truth is, what we'll see is that they have no integrity. They are totally hypocritical, but they're actually trying to use Jesus' integrity to get him in trouble. They're trying to draw him in to say something that will get they can use against him. And part of it is all to do with this: how do we relate to Rome? The big issue for everybody, everyone's concerned about Rome, because what they really want is a Messiah or a king or a savior who's going to come and deliver them from Rome. Because for everyone, Rome is the problem. And so paying a tax to Rome is kind of this question that is like the flagship question, but it just represents so much more. It represents, well, what's Jesus' attitude towards Rome? And the reason why they think they have him trapped is because if he says to pay the tax, and this tax was a specific tax. It was a tax they paid once a year. It was called a poll tax, and it was only for Jews, so Romans didn't pay it. So the tax represented their oppression, in a sense. Like, it represented that they're under an occupying power. So if Jesus says pay the tax, it seems like he doesn't really have an issue with Rome, and he kind of sides with the Herodians, but the crowds and people of Israel hate Rome. And they hate Herod, and they want someone to come and rebel against Rome. So if Jesus says, "Oh yeah, just pay the tax," then no one's going to be interested in anything Jesus has to say anymore, because they already think Jesus isn't strong enough against Rome. That's already why people aren't really taking Jesus seriously. And the Pharisees think, well, this will kind of nail the coffin. It'll just destroy Jesus' popularity. But what they also might think is the case, and maybe what they're hoping for even more, is that by buttering Jesus up and saying that he's a man of integrity, he doesn't care what people think, he's willing to come out and say the thing that nobody wants to say. Everyone thinks it, but no one wants to say it, that no, we should not be paying this tax to Rome. That's what they want him to say. But if he says that, the Romans are not going to be very happy about that, right? He's going to be labeled a revolutionary who's causing a revolt, and he'll be killed. So this is the trap, and they think that they have really got him. He has to say one or the other, and either way, he's going to be trapped. They're going to catch him. He will be discredited. But they think they can play Jesus, but they are about to get totally played by Jesus. They're baiting him, but he's going to totally flip it and hook them. And because of what they just said about him, he doesn't care what they think. He cares about the truth, and he teaches the way of God. So he starts to do that. Says, Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me?" Just straight up. He says, "I know what's going on here, and you're totally disingenuous. This is not a genuine question." They're coming to him, presenting like they're in this really big dilemma, "Oh, Jesus, we want to be faithful to God, but we don't know if we should pay this tax or not. What should we do?" And it's that's just a sham. They don't care about that at all. And he confronts them. He calls them hypocrites. And because it's interesting, right? Because they're kind of trying to put pressure on Jesus to oppose Rome, but really they just want Jesus to say this so then they can go and report him to Rome, and then Rome can kill him. That's why they brought the Herodians along even. They are just against Jesus. They're not actually trying to get a genuine response to an ethical dilemma. That's not the situation. So Jesus knows that they're hypocrites. He calls them hypocrites, and then he proves that they're hypocrites by asking for the coin. There's a special coin that was used to pay the tax, and Jesus doesn't have one. he has to ask them for one. So they have to present it, which shows like they're worrying, oh, should we pay the tax? But they've got the coin to pay the tax in their pocket. So they're hypocrites. And then he asks them, whose image is this? And whose inscription? So they pass him this coin that they have, and then he just tells them to look at it. So they've kind of come with this presentation, like this big ethical dilemma. Well, how do we respond to Rome and taxes? But Jesus says, well, let's just look at the coin. And they look at the coin, whose image, whose inscription, and they say, it's Caesar's. Now, this is so interesting because this is probably what the coin might have looked like. It literally has a picture of Caesar, his name, Caesar Augustus Tiberius, and his title, Son of the Divine Augustus. That his father was seen as divine, so Caesar is seen as the Son of God, which is who Jesus is claiming to be. And so what this is, right, this coin represents is a claim to deity in a sense. So what it is actually an idol. It's a graven image. And one of the main things the Jews are commanded not to do is to make idols, to make or to worship other gods. But they have in their pocket an idol. They have this image of Caesar. But, and the actual problem and the reason why Israel are in the situation that they're in is because they were guilty of this. God called them to be faithful, to worship him alone, to not make idols. But they entered the land and they didn't. They worshipped other gods. So God had to exile them. The actual reason why they're under Roman occupation is because they were unfaithful. So Jesus calls them hypocrites, proves that they are because they are the ones with the coin, and then says that they should give it back to Caesar. He says it this way, so give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Effectively, they're presenting this like ethical dilemma that they're in, as if they're in this real big problem of how do we be faithful to God and pay this tax. But Jesus says, well, that's Caesar's. It's got his image on it. It's an idol in your pocket. Give it back to Caesar. That's not the issue. He says the issue is giving yourself to God. That's what actually got them into this problem in the first place. Jesus is saying the issue is not about giving Caesar what's his. Just do that. The issue is about giving God what is his. Another way of putting it is everyone's putting pressure on Jesus to rebel against Rome, right? And they assume that paying tax to Rome is like giving Rome legitimacy or something. But Jesus just is not that concerned about Rome, the Roman occupation of the land. He says that's not the issue. The main issue is being totally faithful to God, because it's unfaithfulness to God that got Israel into this place in the first place. Another way to think of it is that Jesus redefines the problem. The problem is not primarily the Roman occupation of the land, but the problem is the Roman occupation of their hearts. That they actually are not just having Rome oppress them from the outside, but they've become just like Rome. They worship other gods. They have not given themselves wholly to God. The presenting problem is the tax. How do we pay the tax? But the true problem is that both of these groups who are claiming this dilemma are actually just the same as Rome. They're actually compromised with Rome already. The Herodians are in an obvious partnership with Rome. They benefit from Rome. They use their power and prestige from Rome. But the Pharisees have this false sense of like, no, we're not like Rome and we're separate and we're set apart for God. But Jesus says it's hypocrisy. It's actually a show. Because in actual fact, they're using Rome as their tool to try and kill Jesus. They are actually no different to Rome in the end. Rome is oppressing them, but they just want to oppress Rome. Rome kills them, they just want to kill Rome. There's no actual difference. And we see this so bluntly later on in the Pharisees, who claim like they have all these issues with Rome, but in the end give their allegiance to Rome as a way to kill Jesus. It says this so bluntly in John 19. It comes to this clash when Jesus is arrested. He comes before the Roman ruler Pilate, who says, "Here is your king." And Pilate says to the Jews, but they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate said. "We have no king but Caesar." the chief priests answered. So that they were claiming before Jesus, should we pay this tax? But then they just outrightly claim that they will give their allegiance to Caesar if it will result in Jesus being killed. So they are in league with Rome, or another way to think about it, Rome is totally in their heart. So Jesus is saying, like, the issue of the tax is just not the issue, right? Like the issue is the heart that's not being given to God. The issue is idolatry and unfaithfulness to God. They're presenting this other issue. It's not actually the issue. Now, we don't live in Rome, obviously, and we don't live under an occupying power, but we do live in a world that doesn't follow God for the most part, doesn't honor God, doesn't respect Jesus. And maybe in some ways we kind of feel like we see that more and more, or we see culture changing and the values changing and things shifting and people maybe in some ways rejecting God more, maybe in our sort of part of the world. Even as we were praying before, people walking away from the faith and people leaving church. And this can make us upset, which is right. But what we can be guilty of doing is putting all the problem out there and thinking that the world is changing, the world is the problem, the culture's the problem, and people are being sucked into that. And sometimes that can even be represented by the hot, controversial topics and issues of the day, because there's lots of them. They're probably things that we get like clickbaited to click, right? Like whatever, I'm not going to name any, but whatever the big issue with the society is, that's the debate, that's the progressives, conservatives, whatever it is, there's often get represented by these topics that can just suck us in, and we think that they are the problem. It's out there in the world. They're the main issue. We can get so upset and maybe even feel a sense of faithfulness to God because we're upset. Because we can see all this stuff going on. We can see all these problems. We can see all this issue, and we need to rebel against it, or we need to control it, or we need to fix it. But the challenge of this passage to us is actually a challenge to our hypocrisy. Because we can so easily think the problem is out there. But Jesus would say the problem is in us. We can claim to actually be different from the world, but actually in reality often look very much the same. Or we can claim that we are people who influence the world, but actually the world has way more influence on us. We heard this when Omar preached a few weeks ago. He preached about how the world has a certain definition of success that involves money and popularity and approval and achievement and comfort. And then if we're really honest, we just have a Christian version of that. But actually that is what most Christians and most churches, how we define ourselves as being successful as well. He made the point that actually in many ways we're not that different. Jesus confronts our hypocrisy because we claim to be different to the world, but often we just look the same. And instead of reaching the world, often it's actually the world that is reaching us. To put a summary, I think, of what that looks like, maybe that the life of how the Pharisees are living, of how the Herodians are living, of maybe how our culture lives, of what a life without God looks like. It looks like a life that's defined by self-protection, self-preservation, self-advancement. These are often, I think if I'm honest, these are the questions that fill our minds, which are the same questions as the world. How do we protect ourselves? Which the question below that, which we wouldn't say, is how do we live without God? How do we make things work? And sometimes the church can be guilty of that. We see all these problems in the world, and our response is, how do we protect ourselves? How do we make it better? Rome's question is really, how do we protect our rule? The Herod's question is, how do we protect our comfort? The Pharisees' question is, how do we protect our nation? And we might ask the similar questions in different ways. But the core is that the issue is self-preservation. That's the sort of value system of the world without God. But this is not the question that Jesus... and in some ways, even the tax question can be like that as well. Like, It's this presenting question of the issue of the day, but Jesus says, no, it's the deeper issue. That's the problem. The tax is not the issue. Jesus is saying, let them have their tax. That's not the problem. The problem is seeking to be faithful to God. So they come to try and trap Jesus, but they end up trapped. They end up confronted. They end up unmasked. That the actual whole question is hypocritical, even from the start. And this is what it says. When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away. They were so sure that they had him cornered, but his response just shocks them. But they leave, they walk away. And Jesus confronts them with their hypocrisy, and he confronts us with ours. He challenges those who oppose Rome and says that they're actually no different to Rome. But Jesus is totally different. Jesus is in a whole different category because, like they just said at the start, he's a man of integrity. He's a man of integrity who speaks the word of God with truth and doesn't care about what people think. So when we look at Jesus, we see what is the issues. What is actually important? How do we actually relate to Rome or to the world? How does Jesus do it? Because Jesus invites us to live totally faithful to God, seeking to reflect his image to a world that is against him. Jesus doesn't buy into their false dichotomy. He actually gives himself totally to God, and by doing that ends up actually reflecting God's heart instead of reflecting Rome or reflecting the culture. So what does Jesus do? He doesn't come to rebel against Rome by being like Rome. He doesn't come to kill Romans just because they killed Jews. He comes to love them. He calls his followers to love people who are oppressing them, to love his enemies, to turn the other cheek. Jesus doesn't come to kill his enemies, but actually allows himself to be killed for their sake. Jesus doesn't come compromising truth for the sake of comfort, but speaking truth even at great cost and not being concerned of how it affects him. In summary, what does Jesus' life look like? It looks like a life of self-giving. It looks like a life of self-sacrifice. It looks like the opposite of self-protection. In fact, the kingdom questions, which Jesus would have us ask, are really, how do we trust everything to God? How do we give our lives away in love? Because that's what Jesus does. He's totally abandoned to God, even willing to go to the cross, even giving his life away in love and suffering. But if I'm honest, they're not the main questions that I ask. The questions I ask are much more about self-protection and self-preservation. And I think that can so be common for all of us. But what if this was the question that we asked? What if this was the occupation of the church or Christians? Not how do we deal with these issues in societies so we can protect ourselves, but how do we just totally trust God no matter what's going on in the world? How do we actually just give ourselves away in love to people who hate us and oppress us, and even if they kill us? What if that was our occupation? Not how do we pay tax to Caesar, but how do we give our whole life to God? Because Jesus says that is actually what matters. What if the church had integrity like Jesus, so much so that we just didn't care what people thought of us? So we were actually just willing to speak the truth in love and not worry about the cost. And not that this is the point, but if we were to do that, if our occupation was to be, how do we just be totally devoted to God and faithful to him and reflect his image of love to the world, that would have a huge impact on the world, right? That would lead to mass transformation. It would actually be attractive to the society that we're a part of, even though it would be opposed, just like Jesus was opposed. Because this is what Jesus does. Jesus defeats his enemies not by killing them, but by dying for them. And by dying for them, he actually wins them. He actually shows that you can trust God completely and that this is the way to live in self-giving love. And we even see that happen. Jesus goes to the cross. He dies on the cross, and a Roman centurion says that he is the Son of God. By implication, not Caesar. And he sees Jesus when he's on the cross, that he's the one who actually is true, not Caesar. The early church transformed the Roman Empire not by opposing taxes or creating a revolution or killing Romans. They did it by absolutely giving their lives in self-sacrificial love and not caring at all if they were killed. They just loved people, they loved the vulnerable, they loved the broken at great cost themselves, and then they were killed for it, and they just didn't bother them at all. And they just kept doing that and doing it, and it totally transformed the society. Like that is the power of people totally given over to God. And perhaps the reason that the church has lost influence in our culture is because we've shifted to self-protection. We've shifted to trying to oppose the world or control the world or protect ourselves from the world rather than seeking to give ourselves totally to God and to reflect his love to others, really regardless of what they think of us or how they treat us. Because when we oppose it, we end up looking more like it rather than reflecting God. And the truth is that we're guilty of this. And one of the biggest accusations of people against the church is that we're hypocrites, that we are no different, that we are acting. And if we're honest, it's true, because that's what Jesus says about us, that we are guilty. We are hypocrites. We do claim things, but actually then in our lives, we fail to live it out. We claim to be different, but in the end actually look quite similar. And the truth is, and the good news is, that our message to the world is not that we're not hypocrites. The message is that we are, in a sense, but Jesus isn't. Jesus has total integrity. Jesus is totally true. Jesus does not compromise on anything. Jesus perfectly reflects God's love. And the good news is that though we haven't given ourselves to him, though we've held on to ourselves and not been faithful to him, he gave himself for us. And actually, because of that, we're called to give ourselves back to him. It's actually not that we have to somehow fix all our problems and make sure we get it all together. It's the fact that Jesus has come to us, people who are broken, people who have failed, and he actually buys us and buys us back so that he actually owns us and we can give our lives back to him. I see this in 1 Corinthians, Paul's writing. He says it this way: "You are not your own, for you were bought at a price. Therefore honor God with your bodies." And then he says, in Luke, Acts writes that this cost, what Jesus paid to buy us, was that he bought us with his own blood. Jesus confronts us because we haven't given ourselves wholly to God, which is what he says, that's the thing that matters. But he gave himself wholly for us, and he bought us. So we actually now belong to him. He washes us, he cleanses us, he calls us to then find our identity and our security not in the world we live in or the culture or our possessions or our career or anything that the world might see as a form of self-preservation. He calls us to find our security in the fact that we actually belong to him, and he paid for us so we can give our lives totally to him. So as we respond today, just give you a moment to sort of just sit with that. And Jesus, again, confronts us in love because he cares for us. He wants us to be woken up out of false securities that we have and out of false beliefs that we have so that we can actually walk in the truth and actually reflect his life and his goodness. So what we're going to do is respond. And as we respond, we're going to take communion. Just encourage you to just reflect on the fact of what Jesus paid to buy us who are people who are hypocrites, who have failed, who are rebels, who maybe sometimes we might think that we're not like the world, but actually we're just as guilty. But Jesus paid for our sin. He bought us with his blood. So as you take communion, I just invite you to take a moment. We'll just take just by yourself and just reflect on the cost that he paid. And then as a response to give yourself back to him. And maybe there's been other issues and concerns and questions that have been sort of on the forefront of your mind, maybe about other people or other things or things going on, when Jesus says, just let that go and focus on giving yourself back to him wholeheartedly, because that's what matters. So we'll just pray and then you can take communion. Yeah, Jesus, we thank you that you are full of integrity and truth. You teach the way of God wholeheartedly. You don't care what people think. We thank you that you show us what a life totally abandoned to God looks like, and you are the perfect image and representation of the Father. And thank you for your love that loves sinners and loves enemies, loves Romans, loves Pharisees, loves Herodians, Lord, loves people in our world, God, people that we may disagree with, loves Christians who are guilty, just as guilty, who are hypocrites. We thank you that you love us. That's the Father, that you send your reign, you send your Son on everybody, and Jesus, you gave your life for everybody. And we just ask that you'd cleanse us and wash us, renew us. And we thank you that you bought us, and we just confess that we belong to you, not to this world. We belong to Jesus. We just ask that you'd renew our minds to give ourselves wholeheartedly over to you afresh. And we ask you'd transform this world as we respond to you and reflect your love.